Hello, everybody. Denise here. Welcome to our Red Program review video. We're not gonna have a meeting this time because I plan to make the review of Lab 8 and Lab 9 in the same video because I haven't been able to do the meetings and the review meetings to review the materials. So I figured that it'd be just a good idea to put both of Lab 8 and Lab 9 in one video and review the material here so you guys can have it. So here we have Lab 8. Right now it is May 27th and we are beginning Lab 10. So we're just going to review this really quickly, okay? So in Red Program 136, what Ale began explaining was precisely how her computer broke, right? Her computer broke, and this was convergent with her the integration of her last name, which is Wozniak, right? So here she starts explaining how she's been having trouble with her computer, and at the same time, when her document with the Wozniak surname was being printed, the logic board of her Mac computer stopped working, right? She's saying that, well, she had a lot of trouble with her computer. She lost a lot of work, some of which she had saved in the cloud, which is good, but a lot of the work was not saved in the cloud. So she lost a lot of that, right? So, okay. Here she says, Vuelta 8 is precisely like the unified field being signed in another dimension. When she says being the unified field, what is the unified field? It has to do with the Sol, the space of Sol, being a collective space where particles can come and materialize, because a particle cannot materialize on its own. It needs a collective space. So the unified field is the area where all of these occurrences are manifested together all at once, right? So when she says the unified field being signed in another dimension, this means profiled in another dimension, planified, codified, structured in another dimension, right? So that it can later become a program that can be executed inside a cycle. Okay? So when she says in the cloud, it means that it's not on the plane, right? It's in another dimension. And that lab 8 has to do with this global configuration, which is in relation to the unified field. Okay? So she's saying, okay, in lab 7, she started to recognize this Wozniak surname, right? We all know that the co-founder of Apple Computer, this other guy, the really famous guy, and then the other guy is his last name is Wozniak. Steve Jobs is the first, yeah. The most famous one is Steve Jobs. The other one, last name is Wozniak, right? So she's saying we are talking about the surname or the last name as a code, which is not the same as surname as family identity, which has to do with the documentary order in the memories of this container. When we're talking about the last name as a code, it doesn't have to do with the identity of the family or the grandparents or the parents or anything like that. It has to do with the documentary order in the memories of this container, right? She's calling Earth the container, right? So it's going to have memories that are recorded here, and we are talking about a documentation, which translates into real life. Real life that is being recorded all the time in this recorder, Earth, because this is a unified field. So, what do we have to do to enter this unified field? Okay, then she goes on explaining, how do I go from antenna of the universe to member of the species? These are two different things and they are connected, but how? How are these two things connected? Okay. The antenna of the universe doesn't have to be materially expressed because its main support is a primary unfoldment, and the primary unfoldment does not need to be physically expressed, right? Because it's nothing, everything, something. It is infinite, it has no time, it doesn't exist even. So, how does one go from antenna of the universe to member of the species? Okay, the species is a specific program that has cycles that get experienced in the third dimension, which is the one that allows us to participate in a unified field. This unified field allows our bodies to have a credit base. Remember, secondary unfoldment has to do with code, primary unfoldment has to do with credit. The unified field allows our bodies to have a credit base, which is primary unfoldment, and it also has a counterpart of code, which is to be able to execute a specific content inside a unified container, right? This is why I can't just appear in the middle of the scene. I have to contract with the memories of the fourth cardinality, which is what we call see on, right? So if I'm an antenna of the universe and I want to become a member of the species, I can't just appear in the middle of the scene. I have to make a contract with the memories of the container. Okay? So, to be a member of the species, I also have to contract with a package of memories of a specific group inside the species, which is the clan, the family, right? Because I have to enter into a unified field configuration. Now, that's where I appear into the scene. That's how I go from antenna of the universe to a member of the species. This is where the situation where the last names become relevant. We have all of this previous infrastructure, right? All of these things that nobody talks about in society because it has to do with an interdimensional infrastructure that allows us to appear in this unified field as members of the human species, members of a family, etc. So, LLA is a credit source, and that credit comes from the primary unfoldment. Then we have the clave de sol, which is the local area, right? Of course, every star is going to have its own clave, its own key, the key in which they're going to codify the occurrences of the primary unfoldment. In our case, our local area is the clave de sol. It is the profile where that materialization will be executed with local rules, okay? On top of the clave de sol, we have an open field that has no limitations, and that is why that is a cosmic influence, because all the occurrences of the primary unfoldment are shared. The primary unfoldment is a boundless source of resources. Then these resources are physically printed according to the local rules of each particular star. That is really cool. These resources that are boundless in the primary unfoldment are physically printed according to the local rules of each particular star. Okay, so this primary credit source, primary unfoldment credit source, LLA, she calls there's this another concept that she uses, which is LLA credentials, where the content creators come and they get submerged inside the rules of the container. Clave de sol. It is like there is no assumption of anything in between from the primary unfoldment all the way into the physical manifestation. Like there is no awareness of anything in the middle. It is like directly from the LLAs. That's why she calls them LLA credentials. Okay? They get submerged inside the rules of the container. But The document that is executed in this credit line will have its own regulations and the rules for materializing, right? So when we talk about secondary unfoldment, we're talking about regulations. Primary unfoldment, it is completely unregulated. Secondary unfoldment, it has regulations. Why? Because in order for something to exist, it needs to have limits, right? Our essential belonging is to the primary unfoldment. And because the support is immaterial, the occurrences tend to infinity. That's why our minds tend to infinity, but not our bodies. Our bodies obey the unified field, which has limitations. So our bodies like rhythm, our bodies like sequences, or things that are organized, things that are repetitive. Our body likes that, but not our minds. Our minds like novelties all the time. So if we give infinity to the body, it will get stressed. You have to give the body segments, things that are inside cycles because it obeys the unified field. Now, in what episode of the Clave de Sol do we find ourselves in? It is a critical episode where we will have to show the regulation between primary and secondary unfoldment, which means, like, if she's saying we will have to show the regulation between primary and secondary unfoldment, it means that it hasn't been regulated, right? That's why there is such a lack of synchronicity, such a lack of connectivity, and all of these situations because there is no organizing in the different instances or dimensions that construct our material existence. We are not aware that there are previous instances, and because we alluded all of that to external identity, and we were just creatures and we had no reach there. It was all a mystery. Well, in this episode of the Clave de Sol, that mystery or that episode of being creatures um, managed by an external consciousness is practically done. Now, um, the credit is provided by the LLA credentials, but now the documentation and the regulation begins to be more demanding. Why? Because Sol is trying to qualify as enter an area of the universe which is more civilized and it has higher regulations. Okay, now she starts to talk about our space temporal anchoring instrument, which is the solar calendar, and it's based on a 365 and 360 day calendar, right? And then she starts talking about the Catholic religion, which follows that calendar, right? So it is socially not too bad just because of that, just because it respects the solar calendar. Now, the Pope died, right? Francisco died in, was it lap 7? So the thing is that she starts to talk about the conclave, which is the name that the Catholic Church gives to the process of assigning a new pope, right? And then we have this movie that came out last year, and it's about that precisely. And now the pope dies. So it is like very, I would say educational that these things happened really close together, right? So she starts to talk about conclave. What is conclave? It is with a key. Conclave, clave de sol. The thing is that now the clave de sol will be the one in charge of the regulations for the materialization. Okay, that's with the conclave. Now she starts to talk about she's saying I am a solar consciousness in the first place. She is learning to express herself anatomically as a human person. And in this apprenticeship, Peru was a big part, of course, Argentina. And all these things that educated her so that she was able to represent the subatomic scale consciousness in a codified way inside the anatomic scale, right? So, back to the clave de sol. It is about the solar consciousness that will now be establishing the filter between the subatomic and the anatomic scales. Now, here she starts to talk about, okay, in this specific unified field, which is the third orbital, which is planet Earth, something that is being developed socially is she's saying socially because she's talking about, I think specifically Javier Milei, with this political proposal which has to do with La Libertad Avanza, which means freedom with freedom forward, or freedom moves forward, something like that. But in Spanish, we are saying La Libertad Avanza. We have LLA, right? And what is LLA? It is freedom. It is unregulation because it's primary unfoldment, right? The thing is that we were disconnected from that, and the middle dimensions were completely interfered. So that's why a lot of people felt trapped. Okay. So the question is, what is pulling us forward? Regulation or freedom? Because we have primary unfoldment, which has no frames, and then secondary unfoldment, which has frames, right? Okay, so the mind tends to infinity and the body tends to retraction, to what is controlled, to what is contained. These two things, we're talking about regulations and dysregulations. Now, we are not accustomed to being in contact with different dimensions that have different logics because they're parallel to each other, right? So now that we are working on the growth of our re-axis, we can train ourselves in this formation to comprehend that there's an instance that is not regulated and there is an instance that needs regulation. And they are not opposite, they are complementary, so that space temporal physical existence can actually be materialized and maintain itself as material. We need dysregulations because we need freedom. Oh, am I recording? Yes. We have dysregulations because we need freedom for the antenna, and we need freedom to connect with our source, which has infinite occurrences. It's okay if these occurrences live in the mind and the consciousness. The consciousness will try to codify these occurrences, but later in the unified field, it needs to find a way to materialize them. Okay? So there's an area where we are not regulated, and there's an area where we need regulation so that we can materialize all the things that are not regulated, if we want to do that. The thing is that now these rules become more strict because we are in a very specific frequency of the solar code, right? The last day of lap 7 was solar day 739 365, and lap 8 began with 739 366. Okay, so Francisco dies on day 379 364, which is the position 2 of the clock, right? And also the Ring of Fire. So Alejandra is saying, to my personal interpretation, the Catholic Church is representing the solar regulation because it is tied to the Gregorian year. So for that reason, it is tied to that guideline, and there are interdimensional regulations that are regulating the unified field in the local area. Okay. So When we are talking about Sol and the containing frames, we have a regulated situation. And when we interpret this at the level of the last link, which is the human scale, we find these static regulations that need to be respected, a leader that has to be followed. That's where we find, that is like the context of the Catholic Church socially. Why? Because we are interpreting a regulated situation, but we are interpreting it only through the human scale. That's why we find these static regulations, and we need a leader to be followed, right? Now, this is a very tight profile. It breaks our connection with the primary unfoldment, where we are free, and regulation is put first. So, some people that represent these regulations or these parameters of reading the regulations of the secondary unfoldment only through the human scale, that's why they end up with severe sexual disbalances, attraction for children, pedophilia, and the church. This happens because the secondary unfoldment is put first. The connection with the primary unfoldment is broken, right? So, if I have no connection with the primary unfoldment, the corset, the regulations and rules of the secondary unfoldment, they are too strict, right? And they are interpreted under a memory on top of that. So that is very, very tight. That is like no freedom. That is like lack of air. Okay, so now she starts to talk about some positive, I guess, things that Francisco achieved socially, right? And this is how Ale represents that. The reconciliation with the LLA credentials, which has to do with freedom. Okay? Um, the freedom, the freedom that Francisco interpreted was meeting with dictators, putting his attention in places where there was the most pressure, right? Like saying, okay, we need to amplify our vision here and here and here, right? Why? Because we're talking about the essence, we're talking about primary unfoldment, the essence that tends to infinity, where everything is accepted, right? A church, he talks about a church that accepts everything, everyone, a generosity that tends to infinity. Yes, because that belongs to our essence, primary unfoldment. But that is something that exists immaterially. That's why, that is the only reason why it can be all inclusive, because it exists immaterially, right? But the secondary unfoldment is under particular consciousnesses that pour code into that credit. And that is where we have regulation. Matter exists because the particular consciousness exists. Matter exists because the particular consciousness exists and because it is financed by the primary unfoldment. So one is a source for credit, the other is a source for code. But both things need to understand each other. So LLA and clave de sol, which is primary and secondary unfoldment, are conjugated, and they would produce a unified field. That if sol achieves this interaction between primary and secondary unfoldment, it qualifies as civilized expressed universe. And us, in the local area, we could establish the paradox of creating new configurations in the container at an anatomic scale without dismissing the tasks of the subatomic scale. Remember, we talked about this in the cycle meeting, and the paradox, 1969, which is the native year of Alejandra, right? Paradox being, I am a product of the solar consciousness, but I am enabled to create new configurations in the container at an anatomic scale without dismissing the tasks of the subatomic scale. Okay? We are baby solar consciousnesses. We have failed before. Okay, 739, the value that code 39 will have, which is, can the third orbital pull its own update from the ninth, right? 39. Can the third orbital pull its own update from the ninth orbital, right? So we also have memories, fragments of the solar memory that have having tried this before. So this 739 is providing coverage to something because there were very strict regulations being implemented, and this was about to burst. So the pressure is very strong. It's connected with Earth and with Geo. And Geo is the container of all the egos in here. The thing is that if we have a solar consciousness, we can route with solar responsibility, we can route with Earth responsibility, and finally with human responsibility. And these three channels would be completely independent and would end up syncing. The thing is that if we are resonant with this, it is our responsibility to form ourselves in these situations, which means if I have a solar consciousness, I have to route with solar responsibility first, in the first instance. Then Earth responsibility, and then finally human responsibility, right? But some are only humans, and that's all they can do. So the only thing that does is that they are living in a very tight suit because imagine interpreting things that have nothing to do with the human consciousness and trying to fit everything through that little box. It's going to be very, very tight, and probably people are not going to be very happy inside that. It's going to be tight. Another thing that she rescues from Francisco is that he said that ideas are nice, but that reality prevails in the plane. Reality prevails, right? And this is a concept that is very strong in the Jesuit current, right? Which is I think it's a Catholic ministry, something like that. The dialogue with reality. Then we have the introduction of women into the scene, which is critical in Catholicism. This is also spoken in that movie. I really do recommend it. Conclave, the movie is a very, very good movie. Then she says, but we are talking about men, masculine, and earth as feminine. And here she says something really interesting. Earth is that connector that lends the container for the content. It is a figure that the species has to treat the entorno. The species has a figure through which it connects. So another one of the keywords of Francisco was connect. What was missing from the church? To connect. Connect with people, being with the people with their margin of error, being with the people where they are, right? This notion is what broadens the capacity of the container. But of course, if it's being broadened, then regulations get lost. Like she's saying, okay, maybe it's really hard to understand what is behind putting all the pressure in these situations. What is putting the pressure? It is the solar code, pressuring for the regulation, but also pressuring for the connection with the credit source. Because of course, we won't have credit if we are of no use to the express universe, right? So those occurrences that tend to infinity have to be regulated here. That's the pressure, the solar code putting the pressure for regulations. So here she starts to talk about the 500 days of governance of Javier Milei, which happened on the first day of Lap 8, right? Now, what is Javier? This is like in relation with everything that she's been talking about throughout the emission, regulation and dysregulation, right? The church, what did the church needed? It needed to connect with the primary unfoldment, with the freedom, because the regulations were bursting everything, right? So Francisco did what he could from the place he had, the social role he had, did what he could with what he had, right? And it wasn't all that bad with the lack of resources that he had available. Now, in the case of Javier Milei, which is also a person that has an important social role, and he's putting forward this proposal of La Libertad Avanza, right? So libertad has to do with no with the LLA credentials in the instance where there's no regulation. So what's going on? It's deregulating. Javier Milei, what is he doing? Deregulating, because that means that the real person will have freedom in the antenna because it belongs to a unified field, and that field is the one that will be creating equilibrium and not politics, right? So that is a principle that is being applied. LLA credentials that deregulate, but on the other hand, there is a great regulation in public spending. We're talking about Milei's administration. So he is placing high regulations on the SE cardinality and deregulating the SO cardinality. So that's with Javier Milei. There are infinite protocols that generate these details that we are used to consume in a unified field. There are infinite protocols that generate these details used to consume in a unified field, right? That is where we also find Trump saying, God will do. Yes, of course, because the ideas that Code 1 has come directly from Sol. So yeah, you have a lot of ideas, but what they don't have is the capacity to print them. Who does have that capacity? China. China 86. In the table of elements, that's radon, right? Okay, so why did Alejandra put radon on the 8th level? So that the pressure of this unified field does not burst our native octaves. So on the 7th level, what was configured there was something that allowed us to pick up the signal from the antimatter. Remember, before the radon, we have those negative frequencies, which is 225, 226, 227, and so on. That is what allows us to pick up the signal from the antimatter before level 8, so that it doesn't burst our our gravitational octaves. So we don't burst. We don't burst because how do we not burst? We increment the capacities of the container. And this is so that we keep the task of the solar consciousness active. The task of the solar consciousness active. And then we have the solar consciousness, the consciousness of Geo, and then the last link of the ego consciousness. The ego consumes Geo up until the capacity that the solar code gives it. This last phrase to me is like a synthesis of years of work. You can only understand this last phrase if you have worked on your concepts for years. For me, it was amazing. Ego consumes Geo up until the capacity that the solar code gives it. Simple, yet extremely profound. Okay, here she talks about the Wozniak surname, right? Which she started to work on that or develop that since the reunion on the 20th of February between Trump and Zelensky, right? She asked herself, what contribution can I do for Ukraine? And suddenly she realized she had a forgotten last name. So she started to be in charge of the Wozniak code, which generated this problem with the computer. When her ID was being printed on April 5th is when the computer broke. Here she talks about another thing, another thing that when she bought several machines in Spain in 2014, she had to register this email. She created an email called Okniapple, which meant an unidentified walking object, right? All of those machines also exploded. Why? Because she is no longer unidentified. She is now identified. And she has this brand new insertion into the unified field with reconfigured code, right? So she says this is nothing mystical. This is interdimensional infrastructure. And there are repercussions, okay, to the assumption of the last name. So here we have the routing of the periodic table in relation to this 2025 lap 8. So we have the last 6 elements of the table. And then we begin with the 30 circles of promise that we have on the table from 1 to 10. And she mentions this part over here, this planned template that represents the 4 rings of fire of apparatus 506, which is the anchor of apparatus 507. And she mentions this because of the solar day with which lap 8 begins. That's why she mentions this, right? So this platform, sorry, is what connects the platform of the requirement in the solar code, in the local area. Okay? Why? Because we're talking about the solar calendar. It is a platform of the requirement. Platform of the requirement in the solar code, in the local area. So 739366, the third orbital is able to update the platform 366 that is about the conciliation of the LLA credit with the clave de sol inside the rules of the unified field. That is the reading of that solar day. 739366. The third orbital is able to update the platform 366 that is about the conciliation of the LLA credit with the clave de sol inside the rules of the unified field. And what is the 23rd of April? The antenna of the model is being updated at an interdimensional global scale. Well, okay, so she's talking again about Javier Milei's administration and the political frame they manage, which is called La Libertad Avanza. What do they do? Deregulations so that the human people are able to access the creative freedom and put down into a minimum the political maneuvers that attempt to regulate the unified field. So it is like a very social way to help people reconnect with their freedom, right? But of course, Milei, like the code of Milei is, of course, an attempt of execution from the solar consciousness. Of course, we're dealing with a lot of interferences and a lot of memories in the container and all of these situations. So in lab 8, we also have solar day 739. 369, right? We know that 369 has to do with the concept of senior citizens of space-time. What does the concept of senior citizens of space-time mean? Gravitationally, we have to update our position in the third orbital and behave like space-time adults. Okay, so we also have, where is the three? Oh, here. 739, 369, right? Then we also have Oganesson and Toganesson, right? 119. So she's saying, I don't know what the change will be about, but there will be a change because the Toganesson comes into play. And Toganesson has to do with a base 21 that anticipates to be able to control the social octave. Anticipates why? Because it's put on the left, right? It is an anticipation that's gonna be it's gonna help control the social octave, because if this doesn't happen, the social octave bursts if it's not for anticipation. Another thing she points out is her days of life at the moment when Millet took his place, which are 1972, 7, right? 1972 is the decida year of apparatus 493. And what does Alejandra have to do in relation to that apparatus? Assume 1969, which is the paradox. And what is the paradox? To create code inside the local area, inside the anatomic scale, and that code syncs with the subatomic scale, right? We're talking about the paradox. These are all extremely regulated things because 1972 contains 2 leap seconds. Okay, so all of this it means that we are trying to control the solar code from the local area so that it is not remotely managed anymore. Then she starts to talk about this other concept of 88, which is the protocol for chaos and control. Chaos has to do with freedom and the LLA credentials, and control has to do with the regulations of the secondary unfoldment. Remember, they are not contradictory, they are complementary, or they should be when the protocol is working properly. So, if these two things are not coordinated, the threshold is not crossed. The threshold for sun to qualify, right? Then there was this situation where in Venezuela, the documents of people of 88 years of age was being manipulated. What are they trying to do with this? They are trying to commit fraud with this protocol that Ale is explaining. Because how will these antennas connect with this protocol if they are being interfered? The thing is that there are other dimensions closing and opening our antennas at their will, right? So there is an interdimensional infrastructure, one we have no idea of, that works in a very strict way. It opens or closes signals, opens or closes doors. Why? Because we are a part of the unified field. Okay, so yeah, that is a little review or summary of the Lab 8 Red Review program. I think it'll maybe, because some of you like to listen, right? I read most of it and explained a little bit, but I think it is good just to have the video, just to have the material, and I think, yeah, that you guys will enjoy it and that it will be helpful. Okay, so I thought I was going to record both of them now, but it is quite late. So I will continue with the Lab 9 video tomorrow. And I hope you guys find this useful, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.